a shocking twist inside a Texas courtroom when Judge Raymond Holt mocked Representative Jasmine Crockett. He never expected her fiery comeback to flip the room and end in his arrest. The moment Justice fought back caught live on camera. Cameras captured the unthinkable, a sitting judge in handcuffs after mocking a U.S. Congresswoman. What started as a routine hearing turned into one of the most shocking courtroom moments in recent memory. The man sworn to uphold the law found himself on the other side of it, and the woman he tried to humiliate stood taller than ever before. This was not just a courtroom clash. It was a national reckoning. The tension had been brewing for days. Judge Robert Hensley, known for his strict courtroom manner and cutting remarks, faced Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a woman who has never been one to back down from confrontation. It should have been a simple appearance to discuss an ongoing civil case involving public funding, but within minutes, voices were raised, tempers flared, and what followed left the entire courtroom stunned. Witnesses described the moment as surreal. The judge smirked, mocked her tone, and dismissed her arguments as emotional theatrics. But Jasmine Crockett's response was something no one expected. Calm but firm, she turned the tables with words that cut deeper than any gavel could strike. Cameras rolled as she exposed what she called a pattern of arrogance and bias hiding behind the robe. The air shifted. You could feel it, a woman standing her ground against the very system meant to intimidate her. Within hours, the footage exploded across social media. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett vs. Court and hashtag Judge in Cuffs began trending nationwide. What had been a closed-door hearing became a viral moment about power, respect, and accountability. By the time the day ended, the judge who mocked her was escorted out in cuffs, facing his own charges for misconduct and contempt. This was not politics as usual. This was justice flipping its mirror. Before we unpack how one exchange turned a courtroom upside down, tell us where you are watching from, and do not forget to subscribe for more unbelievable stories like this. Before this courtroom showdown made headlines, the story began with two powerful personalities on a collision course. Representative Jasmine Crockett had already built a name for herself as a fearless truth-teller. Before stepping into Congress, she spent years as a defense attorney standing up for people who had no voice. She earned respect for her sharp cross-examinations, quick thinking, and bold confidence. In politics, she became known for holding her ground, no matter who stood across from her. Her supporters admired her for speaking truth to power, while her critics accused her of being too outspoken. But love her or not, Jasmine Crockett never backed away from a fight when justice was on the line. Across from her stood Judge Raymond Holt. He was the kind of man who carried authority in every gesture. For over 20 years, his courtroom was his kingdom. Lawyers feared his temper, clerks followed his rules without question, and he prided himself on maintaining strict order. He believed that emotion had no place in the courtroom, only facts and hierarchy. To him, power came from tradition and control, and that belief set the stage for everything that would follow. The case that brought them together was, on paper, a small one. It revolved around the allocation of community redevelopment funds in a struggling district. But beneath the surface, it was about something much larger: accountability and respect. Crockett had publicly questioned how local judges, including Holt, were approving contracts and distributing funds. She alleged favoritism, even corruption, and called for a full review. Judge Holt took those comments personally. When she was called to testify as part of a related hearing, it felt less like a legal procedure and more like a duel. Inside that courtroom, tension filled the air long before the cameras started rolling. Crockett represented a new generation: direct, transparent, unwilling to bow to outdated hierarchies. Holt embodied the old guard: proud, commanding, certain that authority alone demanded respect. The contrast was electric. One stood for accountability through exposure. The other stood for order through dominance. Observers whispered that sparks were inevitable. Reporters noticed how Holt's jaw tightened each time Crockett spoke. Some said he saw her confidence as defiance. Others said he underestimated her entirely. Either way, when the hearing began, it was clear that this was no ordinary proceeding. It was two worlds colliding, power on the bench, purpose at the podium, and only one side would walk away unshaken. The hearing began with the usual formality. Papers shuffled, microphones clicked on, and Judge Raymond Holt adjusted his robe with the precision of a man who lived by routine. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat across from him, calm but focused, her notes neatly stacked. The air was tight with quiet anticipation. Everyone in the room knew this was not going to be an ordinary session. Holt's tone carried authority from the very first sentence. He questioned her motives for being there, suggesting that her recent public remarks against the judiciary were politically charged. His words had a sharp edge, meant to remind everyone who was in control. Crockett answered respectfully at first, keeping her tone even, but her eyes told a different story. She had faced tougher rooms before. Then it happened. Holt leaned back in his chair, smirked, and asked, "Are you here to legislate or just to lecture us again?" The courtroom fell silent. His words hung in the air like a challenge. It was not a question. It was a dismissal. Crockett took a slow breath before replying. "I am here for my people, Judge. Maybe you would understand if you left that bench once in a while." Her voice was steady, not loud, but it hit like a strike of lightning. Every person in that courtroom felt it. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some tried to hide their reactions, but others whispered, phones already coming out to record. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. The judge's face tightened, his pride pricked by a woman who refused to bow. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension felt alive, pulsing through the room. Crockett looked composed, almost unbothered, while Holt's jaw clenched. His authority had been challenged in front of cameras, and he was not used to losing control of the room. Inside that silence, something shifted. It was no longer about procedure or testimony. It was about power, respect, and what happens when the old way of ruling meets a new kind of resistance. That exchange, brief as it was, became the spark that lit the fuse. The silence after Jasmine Crockett's last words did not last long. Judge Raymond Holt leaned forward, his expression tight, his voice louder than before. He tried to take back control of the room with the force of his authority. "All talk, no results," he said sharply. "That is what people say about you, Congresswoman. Grandstanding for the cameras instead of getting real work done." His words carried a sting meant to humiliate, not to correct. A few people in the audience nodded, feeding his confidence. Crockett did not flinch. She straightened her papers, lifted her eyes, and spoke clearly into the microphone. "You can say what you want about me, Judge, but my record speaks for itself. The funding I fought for brought housing programs, school repairs, and small business loans to people who have been ignored for decades. That is not talk. That is progress." Her tone was measured, steady, and full of conviction. Before she could continue, Holt cut her off again. "Save it for Congress," he snapped. "This is my courtroom." His voice echoed through the chamber. The statement was not just an interruption. It was a declaration that she did not belong there, at least not in his view. The audience began to split. On one side, a few murmured approval for Crockett's courage. They whispered about how rare it was to see someone speak so directly to a judge. On the other side, some frowned, shifting in their seats, uncomfortable with her defiance. The room was no longer neutral ground. It was a stage for two opposing worlds. Crockett noticed the divide but stayed calm. Her body language said everything. She stood tall, shoulders back, eyes locked on Holt. She refused to let his interruption diminish her presence. He smirked, tapping his pen as if to mock her silence. She smiled back, not in surrender, but in warning. The temperature in the room felt like it had risen. Reporters typed furiously. Every camera caught the unspoken battle of pride and restraint. The judge's contempt was clear, but Crockett's confidence only grew stronger. She spoke again, slower this time, each word deliberate. "You call this your courtroom, Judge. But justice does not belong to one person. It belongs to the people." That sentence landed like a stone in still water. The ripples reached everyone in the room. The power dynamic had shifted. What started as a hearing was turning into a confrontation that neither side could walk away from unchanged. The air in the courtroom grew heavier with every passing second. What started as a clash of words had become something deeper, something raw. Jasmine Crockett's voice carried across the room with steady conviction. "You hide behind your authority, Judge," she said firmly. "You use that bench like a shield to silence anyone who challenges you." Her tone was not raised, but the fire in her words was unmistakable. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Some gasped softly, others leaned forward, unable to look away. Reporters' fingers flew over keyboards, capturing every word. The judge's face hardened. His jaw tightened, as if each syllable from her mouth was a blow to his pride. Judge Holt slammed his gavel once. "That is enough," he barked. "You are out of order, Congresswoman." His voice echoed sharply. "One more remark like that, and I will hold you in contempt of court." The warning was meant to intimidate, to make her fold. But Jasmine Crockett did not move. She stood tall, shoulders squared, her expression calm but fierce. "Contempt," she said slowly. "I have nothing but respect for the law, Judge, but I will not respect the abuse of it." A few people in the audience clapped before being silenced by the bailiff's glare. The room buzzed with nervous energy. The tension was alive, bouncing from wall to wall. Holt pointed a finger toward her. "You are out of line," he shouted. His voice cracked under pressure. Years of authority were slipping away in front of the cameras. Crockett met his glare without flinching. "No, Judge," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I am drawing one between power and abuse." The room erupted again. The crowd could feel that something irreversible had just happened. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure whether to intervene or wait for an order. Reporters exchanged glances, knowing they were witnessing history in real time. Holt slammed the gavel again, his composure fading fast. "Bailiff, control this room," he demanded. But his voice no longer carried the weight it once did. His authority was cracking. Crockett's presence filled the space he had once dominated. She took a slow step closer to the microphone. "You may hold the title, Judge, but that does not give you the right to belittle the people you serve," she said. "Justice is not yours to keep. It belongs to everyone in this room." Gasps spread again as the judge rose from his chair. His eyes burned with anger, but there was something else in them too, uncertainty. The courtroom had turned against him, and he could feel it. Every camera, every lens, every eye was on him now. The bailiff hesitated, unsure of what to do next. The moment teetered between order and chaos. And as the crowd held its breath, the narrator's voice cut through like a whisper against the storm. But his next move would cross every line in the book. For a moment, everything in the courtroom stood still. The tension that had been building between Judge Raymond Holt and Representative Jasmine Crockett had reached a boiling point, and everyone could feel it. The sound of heavy breathing filled the silence. Cameras rolled. The air was thick, heavy with disbelief. Then, in one violent motion, the judge snapped. He slammed his gavel, his face red with fury. "Enough," he shouted. "I will not be disrespected in my own courtroom." His hand grabbed a thick case file from the bench and hurled it across the room. The folder spun through the air, papers scattering like snow, landing just inches from Crockett's feet. The room froze. Every head turned toward her. The sound of a single sheet of paper sliding across the floor was the only thing that broke the silence. A moment ago, this had been a war of words. Now, it had turned into something much darker. Gasps echoed from the gallery. A few people shouted. One woman yelled, "He just threw it at her." Others stood up in disbelief, phones lifted high to record. The bailiff rushed forward, unsure whether to restrain the judge or protect the Congresswoman. The courtroom that once demanded silence was now chaos. Crockett did not move. She looked down at the papers scattered near her feet, then slowly lifted her eyes to the man on the bench. The room seemed to tilt toward her, waiting for her reaction. But she stayed calm. Her voice, steady and measured, cut through the noise like a blade. "You just showed them who you are," she said. Those words hit harder than anything thrown. Reporters caught it instantly. The phrase spread across social media within minutes. Hashtag "showed them who you are" trended as phones flashed, recording the judge's unraveling in real time. The crowd erupted. Some began chanting, "He's done. He's done," while others shouted for order. The bailiff's boots echoed sharply against the marble floor as he moved between them. The sound of camera shutters and frantic whispers filled the space that once belonged to the gavel. Judge Holt tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Remove her," he demanded weakly, pointing toward Crockett, but no one moved. His authority had vanished. The room was no longer his. Crockett stood tall, expression calm, her hands at her sides. She did not gloat, did not raise her voice. She simply turned toward the cameras, her presence alone silencing the chaos. Narration took over as the scene swelled. Power lost its mask in front of millions. What was meant to silence her became the moment that defined her. The judge's fury had shattered more than order. It had shattered the illusion that his authority was untouchable. The courtroom was chaos. The air felt heavy, filled with shouts and the sharp echo of boots across the marble floor. Deputies pushed through the crowd, trying to hold the line, as the judge's face turned red with rage. His voice was cracking now, no longer steady or commanding. He pointed at Crockett and shouted, "I am in charge here." But the room was no longer listening to him. The gallery erupted, their anger boiling over. Some stood on benches, others raised their phones high, recording every second. Chants rose above the noise. "Lock him up. Lock him up." The same words he had once used against others now came back to him. Louder, sharper, carried by a crowd that had finally seen the truth. The bailiff, who had served beside him for years, stepped forward. His hand trembled slightly, but his voice was clear. "Not anymore, sir." The judge froze. His authority, once absolute, was slipping from his grasp. Two deputies moved in and grabbed his arms. The sound of metal cuffs clicked through the silence that followed, cold and final. Crockett stood still. Her expression was calm, almost soft, but her voice carried through the room. Justice just found its mirror. The crowd quieted, listening. Even the phones stopped moving. Her words settled into the air like a closing verdict, the moment when everything turned upside down. The judge struggled, trying to pull free, but his fight was gone. He looked around, searching for someone to defend him, but no one did. The same people who once rose when he entered now stood back, watching as he was led away. The narrator's voice cuts in, steady and low. The gavel fell, but not the way anyone expected. The sound of handcuffs echoed as the doors closed behind him. The courtroom that had been his domain was now the scene of his fall. For the first time, power faced its own reflection and lost. The judge's voice filled the room, loud but shaking. "I am in charge here," he shouted, pounding his hand on the bench. Papers scattered, and the sound of his voice cracked through the air like a broken command. But no one moved. No one obeyed. The authority he had worn like armor was slipping away right in front of everyone. The deputies hesitated for only a moment before moving in. Their badges gleamed under the harsh lights as they reached for his arms. He jerked back, red-faced and trembling. "Do not touch me. I said I am in charge." His words no longer carried weight. They only echoed, empty and desperate. The crowd that had been silent moments before suddenly erupted. Chants filled the room, raw and furious. "Lock him up. Lock him up." The same words he had thrown at others were now coming back at him. Louder, unstoppable. Phones rose into the air, capturing every second. The flashing lights from the cameras bounced off the polished wood, painting the chaos in white bursts. The bailiff stepped forward, his expression heavy but firm. He had stood beside this judge for years, enforcing his orders without question. Now he looked him in the eye and said, "Not anymore, sir." His voice was calm but final, like the last note of a long song. The judge froze, realizing the world around him had shifted. His power, his control, all gone in a single breath. Crockett stood near the defense table, watching with quiet steadiness. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, "Justice just found its mirror." Her words cut through the noise, soft but piercing. The crowd fell into silence for a moment, realizing what had just happened. The narrator's voice takes over, slow and reflective. The gavel fell, but not the way anyone expected. The sound of metal cuffs closed around the judge's wrists. The courtroom doors swung open as he was led away. For the first time, power faced its own reflection, and the truth could finally breathe. Within minutes, the chaos inside that courtroom spread far beyond its walls. Clips of the outburst flooded every platform. On X, threads exploded with captions like "Judge loses it in court" and "Crockett stands tall." Millions watched the same 10-second video on repeat, stunned by what they saw. News alerts flashed across phones. Talk shows picked it up before noon. Commentators from both sides weighed in, turning a courtroom meltdown into a national debate. Some called it justice. Others called it disorder. But everyone was talking about it. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered like it was a crime scene. Microphones and cameras pointed toward the same steps, where silence once ruled. Supporters chanted her name, while critics shouted over them. The noise felt endless, growing with every repost, every clip, and every opinion. The narrator's voice steadies. Within minutes, hashtags replaced gavels. Power had changed hands, not by vote or decree, but by the eyes of a nation. By nightfall, the story was no longer just about a courtroom or a judge. It was about what happens when truth finds its moment and refuses to be silenced. Legal experts wasted no time sharing their thoughts. On morning news panels and late-night talk shows, the same question echoed. Was throwing that file an assault? Attorneys nodded in agreement, explaining that in any other setting, it would be treated as such. The act, they said, crossed a line between authority and aggression. It was not just a loss of temper. It was a violation of conduct expected from the very seat meant to uphold justice. Online, the conversation was even louder. Some called Jasmine Crockett a hero who stood up to arrogance in a system that too often silences truth. Others accused her of provoking the situation, saying her sharp words fueled the judge's reaction. Hashtags divided timelines, turning debate into digital fire. Political analysts joined in, calling it a shift in accountability. They said this moment could redefine what the public expects from those in power. For years, judges, politicians, and public figures acted behind walls of untouchable authority. That day, those walls cracked live on camera. The narrator's tone softens. Whatever your view, power met its match, and millions watched it happen. The story was no longer about who won the argument. It was about what happens when truth, courage, and consequence collide in front of the world. In the days that followed, the impact was impossible to ignore. Jasmine Crockett's name filled headlines again, but this time for a different reason. Her social media followers doubled overnight. Donations poured in from across the country. Supporters urged her to run for higher office, with the phrase "Crockett for Senate" trending for an entire week. Inside political circles, quiet conversations began about courtroom accountability and judicial temperament. Lawmakers who once dismissed reform talk were now drafting proposals. Some said it was about time the system looked at itself in the mirror. Others warned that emotions should never rule over order. Through it all, Crockett stayed composed. She said she only did what anyone should do when power goes too far. The narrator closes softly. A single act of defiance reshaped careers and reminded a nation that power still answers to truth. It started as a routine hearing. It ended as a wake-up call. A gavel hit the desk. A voice rose in defiance. A nation watched as justice turned its gaze back on itself. The final images flash in slow motion. The judge in handcuffs, the crowd cheering, and Crockett walking calmly out of the courthouse, sunlight cutting through the noise behind her. Stories like this remind us that power can fall, and courage can rise just as quickly. They remind us that change does not always come from those who sit highest, but from those who stand firmest. If stories like this keep you hooked, make sure you subscribe now, hit that bell, and join us as we uncover the next moment that changes everything.